Our next speaker is Dr. Beth O'Leary. Dr. O'Leary is Professor Emerita in the Department of Anthropology at New Mexico State University. She's been a leader in the emerging field of space archaeology and heritage. With a grant from NASA, she investigated the archaeological assemblage and the international heritage status of the Apollo 11 Tranquility Base site on the moon. In 2010, she and students successfully nominated the objects and structures at the Tranquility Base site to the State Register of Cultural Properties. Dr. O'Leary has authored and edited numerous books on the topic of space archaeology, including The Handbook of Space Engineering, Archaeology and Heritage, The Archaeology and Heritage of the Human Movement into Space, and most recently, The Final Mission, Preserving NASA's Apollo Sites. She's also a member of the World Archaeological Congress Space Heritage Task Force. Welcome.
Well, I want to thank Julie and Damon for inviting me here tonight and giving me access to this auditorium and a very extraordinary site. I want to start out with my bias, and first of all, I believe that the heavens are really belong to humanity. Nobody can own it. We've been looking up at the sky for a very, very long time, probably since we've been Homo sapiens and maybe even before that. And each culture has stories, have structures, have subsistence practices that are tied to the heavens, that are tied to the movement of the stars and the celestial bodies. The moon is my favorite, and the moon has clocked our days for a long time. I can look at archaeological evidence at Chaco Canyon. There's a crescent moon which is painted on a petroglyph, probably with the Crab Nebula that happened in AD 1054. If you've been to Stonehenge, you know that they erected huge monoliths that were oriented towards the moon's northernmost setting and the southernmost moonrise. I work in the Yukon Territory with First Nations people, and here's how the moon got here. Crow really wanted the moon, and it was kept in a big box by a chief. And he knew the chief had a daughter, so he became a pine needle and floated in the water, and when she came down, she drank it, and he was born. And he was in his father's house, the chief, and he started to cry for the moon. Oh, Grandpa, give me the moon. And like all good grandpas, he gave him the moon, and he threw it up in the sky. So the moon and the stars and the planets belong to everybody. In space archaeology, we really focus our gaze towards the heavens. And I'd like to give a definition of archaeology. It's really the study of the relationship between patterns of material culture and patterns of human behavior. We can study stuff that happened 50 years ago, or Tuesday, when I was putting together this presentation and using artifacts. Archaeology can happen anywhere. It's happened on every continent. It's happened in marine undersea environments. And it can happen off the Earth in orbit and on other celestial bodies. Archaeology happens where human behavior takes place. Space archaeology is really the study of the material culture of outer space that is clearly the result of human behavior. So far, I have not seen alien artifacts. They may be there, but archaeologically, we haven't found them. Space archaeology includes all material culture in the aerospace and aeronautical realms that relate to the development and support of exo-atmospheric activities. And it encompasses a huge area. It encompasses all human behavior on Earth as an anchor to which all space materials are tied. So for me, Earth and outer space are part of a huge cultural landscape. And space archaeology posits that this cultural landscape is a vast interconnecting, and I'm thinking of your slide earlier, of material remains that originate on Earth and then leave it. Well, I want to talk a little bit about the origins of the exploration of space. And Robert Goddard had one of the earliest rockets here in Auburn, Mass. In 1926. But really, the history of the exploration is a Cold War phenomenon. And in 1945, the US and the USSR competed to get both German rockets and German rocket scientists. And the V-2 rocket from White Sands here was developed by a Nazi engineer, Werner von Braun, and other German scientists. And this became really the basis for Cold War missile technology. A decade later, its descendants launched the first satellites and later propelled the first humans to the moon. So for me, the Cold War was not played out just on Earth, but in space as well. In 1957-58, there was an international geophysical year, and there was a contest to see who could get the first satellite into Earth orbit. And space provided this arena for the antagonism between the Soviet Union and the United States. The Soviet Union won with Sputnik 1 on October 4th, 1957. They successfully injected an 83-kilogram satellite into orbit, and this was overshadowed at the time by fear of military threats. A month later, the second Sputnik carried a small, unfortunate dog named Laika. Sputnik was followed by US successes in 1958, and the American Explorer 1 detected the Earth's radiation belts, the Van Allen belts. And then after several failures, we launched Vanguard. Vanguard is still circling above us today. Okay? It has its own website if you want to check it out. But it is the oldest human artifact in space. And its significance can be understood in terms of a space race. There was such a strong emphasis on technological achievement after the Second World War. And these early satellites really provided the basis for the robotic and later the manned missions that went to the moon. Now, besides Sputnik, the Soviet Union had other firsts. They had the first robotic spacecraft to crash land on the moon, which was Lunar 2 in 1959. And they also had the first astronaut or cosmonaut, Yuri Gagarin. And amazingly enough, they put a woman in space in 1963, 20 years before we put Sally Ride up. The focus of this panel seems to be on a very extraordinary site in the Corona program. And the first Corona, and that's the name given to the secret name given to what was first called the Discoverer program, contained a camera and telemetry and a payload that put this satellite up into orbit in 1960. I think during the research without the development of Corona, the evolution of spaceflight that took the first humans to the moon would have been vastly different, okay? The US might not have met its primary goal that Kennedy set in 1961 to put a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth. And meeting Julie and Damon, I realized more of the technology that went along with achieving that goal. I first became aware of the Corona when I was working with Hanna Srepanowska at the Smithsonian. And she had received as a curator in 1995 from the National Reconnaissance Office, a KH-4B camera and part of a film return capsule that had been put together from spare parts, and it was donated to the Smithsonian. It was the last and the most advanced camera of the Corona program and was capable of achieving a resolution of 6 feet. It's the only camera to survive the program, and there was little paperwork that went along with it. So she had to look through archives and essentially test the materials and find out how it was built, where it was built, and what role it played. And the exhibit at the Smithsonian Air and Space now really fulfills the educational mission of that museum, which is proper preservation and understanding our history in space. It was America's and the world's first successful space-based imagery. And it was a collection platform to take images, okay? It was critical because it exemplifies the technological development of space system. The former CIA director, Richard Helms, said Americans can view this and the men of Corona, I guess there weren't any women, like the Wright brothers, for the role they played in shaping history. Through the analysis and the conservation of the cameras and the capsules, we can provide insight into culture, behaviors, and the socio-political conditions of the Cold War. Well, when I went out there, I was amazed by the layout and the construction and the locational integrity of these calibration marks. There's a lot of stuff out there that archaeologists can ask, a lot of questions. How, when, and who determined how the site was constructed? And according to Damon and Julie, there are many different landowners and stakeholders. It's private, it's federal, it's state land, it's county land. It's Native American land. Some of the marks no longer exist, some of them are in ruins, some of them are quite complete. So for me, all those marks are a huge archaeological site, in excess of 260 square miles. So the questions an archaeologist would ask is, how was this location chosen? Has the site changed since its inception? And how was the grid laid out? If you notice from some of Damon's lovely images, it looks like they might have been on section corners. Was it plotted by USGS coordinates? Were local materials used? Who provided them? How did the local community at the time they were built interact with the NRO, the National Reconnaissance Office, the Air Force, and the US Army Corps of Engineers? And then to get to the present, how is the site viewed today by local residents and/or tourists? And when the program ended, what happened to the stakeholders? Given the condition of these, of this amazing site and the fact that it's over now 50 years old, should there be methods and legal ways of preserving them so that people can appreciate them in the future? I did a little research after I saw this site and the photographs. And in the Encyclopedia Britannica Book of the Year for 1962, between October 60 and 61, there were exactly 35 satellites put into space, okay? 27 of them from the US and 8 from the USSR. 11 of the 27 were this Corona Discover program. So if we were to superimpose the plot at the time that some of these marks were built, there'd only be a few lines in the sky. When archaeologists decide to evaluate a site for significance, what makes it important? We have to look at the historical context. And the legal definition for significance is the relevance to events, people, method of construction, and if it can answer questions that are important in history and prehistory. Well, at the end of World War II, the beginning of the Cold War was a time of great conflict with the USSR, and it was vital as this relationship deteriorated to know what capabilities the USSR had. So the secrecy around the development of nuclear weapons and what kind of missiles and how many different groups had involved a lot of different technology. The U-2 plane, and the pilot here, Gary Powers, was an early investment in providing imagery of the Soviet Union to look at what the military had. Unfortunately, it went fairly well until May of 1960 when he was shot down. And this international incident caused Eisenhower to ramp up a program where satellites would start spying. And during its lifetime, the Corona involved many, many different kinds of scientists, academics, manufacturers, Department of Defense, and the intelligence community. Many people that I was reading about believe that Corona provided the intelligence that prevented a nuclear disaster. The multi-level cooperation that had to go on during the Corona resulted in great technological advances in rocketry. How many of us have used GPS to get here or looked at Google Earth? The launches of the Corona program with the Agena rocket and a Thor booster were from Vandenberg Air Force Base. And it had many firsts, and one of the big ones was that during its lifespan, it was the first time that an object had been retrieved from space. The Corona did that. Now, there are other satellites that are interesting. The progression of the technology really advanced, and the USSR had Luna 2. Luna 2 was a rocket. It was called the moon rocket in the Soviet Union. It impacted the lunar surface in September of 1959, way before our space program. And then they had Luna 17, which you can see on this slide, which carried a rover, a little lunicod. These were all robotics. They weren't manned missions. And recently, the LRO mission, Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter mission, actually located the spacecraft and the tracks. So the neck-and-neck competition, which continued the space race, put pressure on the US to be the first to land astronauts on the moon. The Apollo 11 mission took off on July 16, 1969, and it carried 3 astronauts, Michael Collins, Buzz Aldrin, and Neil Armstrong. It was a very risky mission. It had occurred after many setbacks, like a fire that destroyed a capsule and took the lives of 3 astronauts. Apollo 8 had been pushed ahead to orbit the moon early, and the US thought at that time that the Soviets would be the first. For those of us, and I'm looking around at the gray hair, who watch this on TV, it's now approaching the 50-year mark when they first landed on the moon. Going into space and onto other celestial bodies represents, I think, the highest level of human technology. Rhetorically, this is the ultimate high frontier. But space exploration is based in a global landscape which is tied to conquest. I had the privilege of interviewing Frank Borman, the astronaut from Apollo 8, and he said the Apollo program wasn't a voyage of exploration or expertise in advancing technology. It was a battle in the Cold War. Well, I started this research because a student in a graduate seminar said, "What's on the moon, and does federal preservation law apply?" You get great questions, you better run with it. So we got a grant from NASA, and we looked at essentially what's there, and we decided to focus on one site. Currently, there are 91 sites on the moon. There's over 200 metric tons of cultural material on the moon. Okay. 600 million people watched when Armstrong stepped on the surface. What do we know about it as an archaeological site? Well, here's an archaeological sketch looking at the LEM, that's the lunar module that landed, And for 8 minutes, they stood on the corner and threw out things that were not important to lessen the weight. They had collected about 20 kilos of lunar regolith, the dust and the rocks. So this is an archaeological toss zone. We discovered, to our surprise, that NASA really doesn't have a complete list of everything. I'll show you some of the artifacts they do have. They invented tools to go to the moon. The scong was a combination tong and scoop to collect some of the samples. It brought back samples that we know now are 3.7 billion years old. The thing in the middle is the lunar laser ranging retroreflector, and it's still in use, okay? And it helps determine how far the moon is moving away and the exact distance from the Earth to the moon. It had there were symbolic artifacts up there. If somebody comes and can read English on the moon, they can read, "We came in peace for all mankind." It also has a mission patch from Apollo 1 commemorating the astronauts that died. This LRO image was taken of the site in 2009. It's an amazing satellite sensing technology that archaeologists can use. When the mission was completed, it hit the south pole of the lunar surface, and that created yet another archaeological site. I worked early on at a local level, putting the actual objects and structures at Tranquility Base on the moon on both the California and the New Mexico Register in 2010. That was followed by Hawaii. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to show you two other little-known sites like the Corona that we researched. This is the high-speed test track at Edwards Air Force Base in California. Colonel John Stapp rode a rocket sled here, and he became the fastest man on Earth to test the G-force for humans going into space. He reached a speed on a rocket sled of 632 miles per hour in 5 seconds and a stop in 1.4 seconds, and he lived. This is Colonel Joe Kittinger, who still holds the record for the longest free fall of 102,800 feet, or 19.5 miles above the surface of the Earth. I always think it looks like he has duct tape on his fanny here. But he jumped out of a balloon, and he has the longest free fall record. This, again, was to test for how humans survive. If I had thought to be the world's first lunar archaeologist or space archaeologist when I started doing research